But Adams actually, oddly, was almost more writing in the vein of like the 1% versus the 99% in a certain way, which is how a little bit we're sort of reconstituting political debate now. That sort of merges with this fixation on meritocracy. And Adams thought that meritocracy wasn't just sort of misleading it was actually hiding the fact that the natural aristocracy was kind of like the old aristocracy in the sense that it still had a lot to do with birth and luck and everything else. But we were creating a different discourse on it that made it seem like it was about merit. So maybe you could touch on that and then get to a few more of the solutions that you might see in current politics and society.
Yeah, I think that that's right. That Adams's view of class is really quite similar to the conceptualization of class that's recently emerged between the 1% and the 99%. In some ways, this new way of dividing, I mean, not entirely new, but this newly popular way of dividing society between the few and the many, the 1% and the 99%, really is an echo of the classical way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
If, as you mentioned, if you look back at liberal, left-leaning thinking before the last 5 years, going back to the war on poverty, for example,
mm-hmm.
There really is, when people talk about classes in society and the class problem in society, it's something less like the privileged, wealthy few and the non-rich, non-wealthy many,
mm-hmm.
and it's something more like, something like the bottom 20
mm-hmm.
and the affluent many, right?
Mm-hmm.
The poorest 20% of American society and the affluent middle and upper middle classes and also the rich. And that's the kind of divide. And we've shifted, in shifting to the divide between the 1% and the 99%, we're really shifting back in a way, to the way that, Aristotle thought of the basic division in society, and Machiavelli and,
mm-hmm.
and John Adams, this division between the few and the many. And that's important, and I think it actually gives a new energy, and it really revitalizes this historical strain of thinking, and it makes it relevant again to think about these old ways of thinking about oligarchy and the problem of oligarchy. Now, I want to speak to this what you call debunking of meritocracy.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a good way to put it, because Adams was skeptical of the idea, this idea, as I mentioned, is promoted especially by Thomas Jefferson, that yes, oligarchy is a problem, but the solution is meritocracy. That in order to avoid rule by the rich, we should opt for rule by the talented. And Adams thought, and this is the key point, he thought that it was too easy. It would be too easy if we opted for the ideal of meritocracy. It would be too easy to simply use the language of talent to talk about wealth and to talk about other things like family background or family name that weren't really talents, but were in fact more like privileges. And one example of this is a snarky letter that he wrote to his friend Benjamin Rush about George Washington. And he wrote about Washington, what he called George Washington's 10 talents. And as he begins the list of talents, it becomes clear that the things that people love the most about Washington aren't actually talents at all. So among Washington's so-called talents are things like a handsome face, a tall stature, and his extraordinary wealth. Adams lists as one of his talents.
Mm-hmm.
Listeners might be familiar with the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche and his idea of the genealogy of morality.
Right.
This idea that if you look into the origins of our moral language, you'll often find more primal meanings that have less to do with morality and more to do with raw relations of power.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not saying that Adams was a Nietzschean in his view of morality, or that he was something like a proto-Nietzschean or something like that. I think the truth is far from it. But at one point, in a letter to Jefferson, he does carry out this fascinating Nietzschean kind of genealogy of meritocracy and of the language of meritocracy. So in this letter, he writes that words like gentleman and generosity, the same words that are often associated with virtue and talent at that time. In fact, if you looked closely at their genealogy, they traced back to the Latin word generosus, or the Greek word eugenic. And these roots didn't have anything to do with virtue or talent originally. They meant not of mean birth and born of a noble race. So the larger point here is that Adams feared that the ethic of meritocracy, if it were adopted, wouldn't lead to a real meritocracy, but instead would just lead us to redescribe oligarchy in a kind of meritocratic language.
Right. Well, here we are.
Hey, it's Sam Seder. Why don't you subscribe to this channel? You can do so right over here. Subscribe.